Hi, my name's Andy Parker, owner and head brewer at Elusive Brewing and author of CAMRA's Essential Homebrewing. I'm down at the Malt Miller in Swindon today to walk you through your first ever brew, from grain to glass. In this video, we're going to talk about fermentation, that is, turning your wort into beer, the importance of temperature control and managing the fermentation from start to finish. So we've cooled and aerated our wort, so we're at the stage where we want to pitch the yeast and start the fermentation. Before we do that, we're going to take a gravity reading. That's really important because we want to know, once fermentation's finished, how much alcohol is in our beer. So we want to measure the current gravity. So here we've got a trial jar that we've filled from the tap of the fermenter, and we're going to drop in a device called a hydrometer. Now this, as you can see, kind of looks a bit like a fishing float. So we're going to drop that in there, and that's going to float depending on the viscosity of the wort sample we've taken. And you can see we're around about 1050. Now that we've taken our gravity, it's time to actually get our yeast into our fermenter. Now, yeast comes in different formats. When I started homebrewing, I used to use lots of dried yeast, and that's what we're going to use in Level Up. USO5 is a nice clean fermenting 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃𝗍 yeast. But these days there are literally hundreds of different yeast varieties you can use, and they come in various different formats. Here we've got liquid yeast from two different manufacturers, and these are ready to pitch quantities of yeast. Now when we talk about yeast, it's important that we pitch the right amount of yeast for the wort that we've got. Now if you have a look at the instructions on the packet, typically these off-the-shelf packets are the correct volume for 5 gallons or around about 20 litres of wort. So we're going to pitch our yeast. Now this is dried yeast, so we can pitch it straight in. If we were using wet yeast, we want to let that come up to the right temperature because it will have been stored in the fridge to keep it nice and fresh. So it's important when we pitch wet yeast that it's the same temperature as your wort. So here's our dried yeast. Now we're just going to sprinkle that on. And then we're going to seal up our fermenter. So push the lid down. And now you'll notice that in the top here, we've placed an airlock. So from this point on, as the fermentation progresses, the yeast, once it's kind of multiplied and reached the viable point, it will start to ferment our wort. That fermentation produces alcohol and CO2. That CO2 needs to escape from the FV. Otherwise, you're going to start to slowly bloat and carbonate and could get a bit messy. What we do is we place this airlock into the top of the FV. You can see we've got a grommet here, and that allows the CO2 to bubble out and escape through the airlock, and also prevents anything getting into our beer because we want to protect our precious beer from any external factors. So we pop the lid on there. And once fermentation starts, you'll start to see that bubble. These are called bubbler type airlocks. And as a home brewer, that's a really reassuring noise when that starts. So different yeasts require different fermentation temperatures, depending on the style of beer that you're looking to brew. Now, we talked about there being hundreds of different strains of yeast, and they all have their ideal parameters. So for the yeast we've used here today, which is our 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗃𝗍𝗃 yeast, effectively, this is pretty happy, sat at a nice 20 degrees throughout fermentation. If you're brewing, for example, a Belgian Saison, that yeast really loves a nice warm temperature. And those yeasts are known for creating lots of esters. And ester is kind of an aroma and flavour that the yeast contributes to the beer as it ferments. So do read up about the yeast that you're going to use for your fermentation. Make sure you get the right temperatures for that yeast. So maintaining the right temperature for the yeast is pretty important if you want a nice clean fermentation. Now, when I started homebrewing, I used to brew the right style of beer for the right time of year. So I didn't have much in the way of fermentation temperature control. I used to sit my fermenter on the floor in the dining room. Now in the summer, I used to love brewing Saisons. Saisons really don't mind nice warm temperatures. In fact, they like it and really pushes the quality of the fermentation. But for an ale yeast, we want to keep it fairly cool. So that worked for me in the autumn and so on. So there are different ways of maintaining the temperature. You can, more advanced homebrewers will have a temperature controlled fridge, for example, where you've got a heat mat and a fridge and a temperature controller, which will maintain and manage that temperature throughout fermentation. But more simply, you could perhaps wrap the fermenter in a quilt or a towel to keep it warm if it's cold, and so on. So important, as we say, to maintain the temperature that the yeast requires for your fermentation. So as we said, the bubble at airlock here will give us some clues as to how the fermentation is progressing. When that starts bubbling, at the start you'll get a really vigorous bubbling, and that's because the yeast starts nice and quickly and starts to turn our wort into beer. So what we can do throughout the fermentation process is monitor the gravity as we showed you with the hydrometer. And what we're looking for is a stable gravity so that we know the fermentation is finished and your beer is ready to package. Now typically that's going to take around about 7 to 10 days, but it does very much depend on the yeast that you're using. For this beer with our US-05 yeast, I'm expecting the primary fermentation of around about 7 days. Now this recipe calls for dry hopping as well. So we're going to add some hops into the fermenter and allow those to sit in the beer to add more aroma to the finished product. So at the start of fermentation, you'll remember we introduced oxygen because oxygen is required for yeast to grow and become viable. Now from this point on, oxygen is very much our enemy. So we need to be very careful not to introduce any oxygen into the beer. When you're dry hopping, yes, lift the lid very carefully and gently pour those hops in, seal that back up, and then wait for that dry hopping period to pass. So we've used the kit from the Malt Miller to brew a nice batch of Level Up. We've fermented it, it's been dry hopped, it's been cooled, and it's ready to package. So if you want to learn how to package your beer, watch our next video. If you'd like to learn more about fermentation, have a read of my book, or go to the Malt Miller website for more info.